Chapter 17. All our kids have fits. My baby had sunbaths, vegetables, meat, and cod liver oil. My neighbors viewed these practices in the same light as charms and asafoetida bags. Even though I showed Mrs. Kettle the printed instructions in the government bulletins I had sent for, she was convinced that it was more crooked work on the part of, quote, them politicians, end quote, and would bring my baby to an early grave. Her babies and her children's babies, all the babies she had ever had anything to do with, had been fed pork gravy, mashed potatoes, pickles, beer, and had, quote, fits, end quote. The number of fits, actually convulsions, a child survived was the measuring stick of the father's virility, the mother's knowledge of dietetics, and the child's superior physique. The Kettles sat around their fire in the evening, and Ma would say, "Let's see, was it Charlie or Bertha that had 17 fits in one day? God, was that a day?" She'd sigh reminiscently. The children would urge her on. "Go on, Ma, tell us. And don't forget the time Ellen was blue in the face for 2 hours." Ma would begin, "Let's see, Elwood was more than a year old. I was well along in the family way with Ernest. It was a real hot night. Elwood had summer complaint bad all day. He was fretful, and I took him upright after supper and was rocking him in the kitchen when all of a sudden he stiffened out and begun to foam and get black, and I see he was in a fit. So I put a wet rag on his head, and pretty soon he came out of it. He was all right for about an hour. Then he got another one, then another. Finally got so bad, I got scared and sent Pa for the doctor. But the car had 4 flat tires. I've been meaning to fix them tires all week." Pa would interrupt. "And Elwood kind of turned blue. His eyes rolled back and he looked awful. I looked and he was dying. I began to bawl, but Pa filled the wash tub with real hot water, and he dumped Elwood in clothes and all, and just kept his head out of the water. And after a long while, he begun to come out of it. Jesus, that kid was limp. Just like a rag doll, and white. He looked just like a hunk of sow belly." I would glance at Elwood to see how he reacted to this unflattering description, but like many younger children in a large family, he was so delighted to be in the center of attention that he wouldn't have cared if Ma had said he looked like a pig's intestines. Elbows on knees, chin popped in his dirty hands, his large blue eyes gazing at Ma through the shock of her hair hanging over his face, with the intensity of a sheepdog waiting for a bone, he would sit in happy expectation. Ma continued, "Well, I finally got that kid ready for bed. I looked at the kitchen clock." All heads would turn toward the kitchen clock on the shelf over the sink. "And Jesus Christ, that kid had been in that fit for 2 hours." At this, Elwood would straighten up and look proudly at the assemblage. He would stand and turn around several times, and his family would agree that Elwyn was a fine specimen, and to think he had been blue for 2 hours. One summer morning, I pushed Anne's crib onto the front porch and put Anne without any clothes in it for her sunbath. Mrs. Kettle came through the orchard just then to borrow some eggs because the chicken had taken to laying in the deep forest down by the creek. When she saw the baby, she was horrified. "You ain't going to leave that kid out here, are you?" she said incredulously. "Of course I am," I said. "She has a sunbath every morning." Miss Kettle said, "Joe's wife has a baby just 2 days older than that one, and he'd make 2 of her. She don't give him no sunbaths." She poked disapprovingly at Anne's fat, dimpled back. "Yep, Jeannie's baby would make 2 of that one." Perhaps a week later, I had an opportunity to compare Jenny's baby with Anne. Joe Kettle was hired to install a gasoline engine and water pump for Bob. Joe arrived about 10 o'clock one summer morning, bringing with him to spend the day his wife, Jeannie, and Georgie, their big white baby. Jeannie was a beautiful girl, about 19, with soft brown hair, dancing eyes, and dimples. Georgie was 8 months old and looked as if he had been molded out of dough. He was certainly large and rolling in fat, but he was logy and fretful, and every time he squeaked, Jeannie ripped open the front of her dress and nursed him. She fed him 6 times between 10 and 5, and when she wasn't nursing him, she was tossing him in the air, jiggling, tickling, bouncing and shaking him, and giving forth a torrential flow of gossip. When I gave Anne her vegetables, cod liver oil and applesauce, Jeannie was horrified. She said, "Jesus, kid, I think you're taking an awful chance. Georgie don't get nothing but my milk, a bite of potato, and gravy once in a while. Sometimes a little candy. Look how big and fat he is." I asked Jeannie if Georgie had ever had a fit. She said, "No, he ain't had one yet, but I guess he will. All kids have fits." The day was warm and muggy, but Georgie had on knitted booties, shirt, diaper, flannel petticoat, white petticoat, dress, and knitted jacket. And when Jeannie took him out of doors, she put a blanket over his large white head, for babies were not supposed to be exposed to air in any form. When a baby was taken out, even on hot summer days, he was bundled up like an Eskimo. His bedroom, usually shared with several other people, was filled with its original quota of air and sealed tight against any intruding draughts. Apparently, the babies liked the life, though, for they lived to grow up, and certainly their lives were more fascinating than those of modern babies with their regular hours, sterile bottles, and hands-off policy. The farm baby went where his mother went, and when she had coffee, he got some. When she had beer, so did the baby. And he spent many of his happiest hours in the movies, at the dances, or being passed from lap to lap in some warm, gossipy kitchen. That was a great country for babies. People were always having them in spite of home aborting. More often than not, the babies were dirty, runny-nosed, and smelly. Sometimes they were not bright, but they were fondled and loved just the same. Even the men, who were frequently brutal to their wives and usually cruel to their animals, were not ashamed of loving babies and stopped to admire other people's and took their own, drooling and wet, with them when they went calling. Anne, with her red curls and fat, dimpled, rosy cheeks, drew an admiring crowd wherever we took her, and it was only owing to my strong will that she did not develop a weakness for pickles, beer, coffee, and fits.